Hi everyone. This is the Liverpool Dementia and Aging Research Forum for the first time as a webinar. My name is Clarissa Giebel. I'm very sorry for those technical difficulties we've just experienced, but it's the first time that we've moved the forum to a webinar version. So thank you everyone for sticking around and for joining us. That's great. So today, Dr. Sarah Robertson will be giving her talk on long-distance caring in dementia. And Sarah is currently finishing up her clinical psychology doctorate at the University of Liverpool, and she'll be talking about her research and clinical work there. And long-distance caring is all the more important now during the time of COVID. And just a few logistical things about this webinar. So we'll be sharing the slides throughout this webinar, and I will move over to Sarah soon. And throughout this talk, which will last about 30 to 40 minutes, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box, and we will be picking them up. And afterwards, there will be about 10 to 15 minutes time where we will have a discussion about those questions with Sarah. Okay, so please feel free to drop those questions throughout the talk. Okay, so I will now move over to Sarah. Okay, and yeah, so enjoy the talk.
Thanks very much, Clarissa. It is wonderful to be here virtually talking with people about my research about long distance carers, and I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties. These are the kind of things that give you sleepless nights as a presenter, but it's all okay. We're here now. I'm going to indicate to Clarissa when to click the next slide. Hopefully you've all got a picture of the beautiful University of Liverpool, where I've been studying clinical psychology and training, so working clinically and then doing research. My background is actually in dementia research, and I've always been really keen to attend these forums and hear more around what is going on. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to my supervisors who are hopefully listening, Dr. Sarah Butchard and Dr. Penny Rappaport. So Penny's based at the University College London, where I did my PhD before, and fortunately we've been able to maintain our connection over the distance and do this work. So also wanted to thank all of the partners who've made this research possible, helped with recruitment, and a huge thank you and acknowledgement to all of the long distance carers who shared their stories really altruistically for the purpose of research, and that has meant revisiting difficult times and thinking in depth with me about that. So a huge thank you. So a little bit about what you can expect from the webinar. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, and hopefully you've got a slide up about the webinar overview now, talking about why we should be thinking about distance carers, our aims with the work, so what we were focused on, how we conducted the research and the methodology, and what we found. So I'm really interested myself in the clinical implications and what we can do and what we have learned from this research. So the next slide, thanks Clarissa. So as many of you are aware, dementia is a public and political priority, and we have an ageing population across the world, and more people are living with dementia than ever before. In the UK, we have 885,000 people living in the UK with dementia, and around 700,000 carers who are caring for them. So dementia is a neurodegenerative illness that famously affects memory, but also affects other aspects of people's lives, like their attention, their motor abilities, language. All aspects of cognition can be affected by dementia. And because of that, often people require support with meeting their daily needs and living well. And carers can be involved in a number of different tasks. Carers make an absolutely vital contribution to dementia care. They make the largest contribution in terms of costs, which equates to about £11.6 billion a year. And I think there's a recognition from governments worldwide, and here this statement is from the Prime Minister Dementia Challenge in the UK, that family carers are the most important resource available for people with dementia. So actually services rely heavily on carers to meet the needs of people living with dementia. And I think that's really important actually if we think about the context of services and how services have maybe been stretched and redirected in COVID, and the impact that that might have on carers as well. So the next slide please, Clarissa. So with that, there's a recognition that we need to support carers, and actually carers, because of many of the difficulties associated with the caring role, are more likely to experience clinical significant anxiety and depression. So as many as 30 to 55% of carers can experience anxiety and depression. And also many people are stepping into these caring roles whilst experiencing their own loss. I've put here that adult children have unique experience, and I think the experience of adults caring for their parents is often people are experiencing existential shifts from being cared for by that person to caring for them, and it's a really complex experience with a lot to understand and to know about carers and what might help. So in NICE guidelines, the 2010 and 2018 ones, there's a recognition that carers need additional support, and they need to have a tailored assessment of their needs and interventions that can meet them. And carers have the right to an assessment granted through the Care Act, which is fantastic that that exists, but in practice, support for carers is incredibly patchy, and I think lots of the carers I've interviewed would say that it's been inadequate actually. So the next slide please, Clarissa, is around distance. So why think about distance carers then? And I think the main point about this is that distance carers are often not talked about. So much research focuses on carers that are convenient to reach, that are more local and known to services, where there are lots of children that have moved away from their parents and live life quite separately, and then step up into a caring role later, despite the distance. And what we know about this group of carers as well is that these geographical distances are growing. Between generations, more people are moving away. It's more likely that people will be living at a distance. And a distance is usually defined as an hour or more away from somebody. But we didn't define that. We asked people to self-define themselves, and people were usually a lot more further than an hour away. I think my interest, and certainly I hope your interest in joining today, has definitely expanded around thinking about new distance and felt distance with the enforced distance that more carers are away from their parents living with dementia to keep them safe. And I hope today that through listening to this webinar, you have some idea of what the sort of emotional and psychological consequences are of that, and what we might need to do to support carers. So, given that background, what we wanted to do was to hear the story of adult children caring for their parents living with dementia from a distance. And to our knowledge, this is the first in-depth exploration of that. And we were looking at hearing the stories of carers to understand what they experience and when, get more information about the timeline of events, understand how those events are experienced and what the inner world is like of the distant carer, and we're hoping that that can help inform support. So the next slide is on self, and hopefully that's up there for you now if Clarissa can click through, and that is thinking about myself and my position and how that shaped the research. So I mentioned before, I have a background in dementia research. I did a PhD before on the MARC study, which is the largest care home study to date, with a huge number of care home clusters, 96 recruited nationally, and we had about 4,000 participants and lots of quantitative data. And I wanted to be part of that team because I have a background myself where my nana developed dementia. And that's really always motivated me to learn more around how to support families because my own family was affected. And this experience of working on a large scale study as well made me think a bit more around using in-depth qualitative methods as well and what we can learn from those. And that's why I focused on stories and the in-depth analysis I'll share with you today. Also, this is very much shaped by my experience of training. I've worked in 2 older adult service placements, one a memory service assessing for dementia and working with families to provide post-diagnostic support, and also working in a community mental health team and an inpatient ward, thinking around families and what they need when they're affected by dementia. So I've got personal and professional experience, and I'm also a psychologist, soon to be, all things being well, qualified in a couple of months, and that has affected what I've chosen to focus on. So now the next slide, please, Clarissa. Hopefully you've got a lovely flow chart here that shows you where we recruited distance carers. So we were creative about the methods we used because we wanted to find this group, and we didn't want to assume we could reach people through services. So we used local recruitment networks and groups of carer support in London and also in Liverpool, and recruited within an hour of those locations. And then we also recruited through Twitter and joined Dementia Research, and we asked carers as well to ask if they knew somebody more locally who might want to take part as well. So I think that's helped us. I found recruitment really easily. Lots of people came forward and wanted to share their story about this. I think that because of those methods and where we've got participants from, it's also quite closed networks and affected the sample. So we'll think about that. So next slide, Clarissa, is on methods and is looking at narrative inquiry. So I mentioned stories, and I think that stories have a huge potential to describe experiences and to learn from them. I think we naturally organise our experience in stories, and we tell people about what we've experienced in stories. But narrative inquiry sort of has this sort of scope to look at both the landscapes of action and the landscapes of meaning. So what's happening in the world, what do people experience underneath that, how is that interpreted, and what is the subjective lived experience of that? This is the kind of double signature of narrative methods and its history. So I'd love to take more questions about that if people are interested. Just so you understand how we collected the data, the next slide, Clarissa, thanks, explains the narrative interview. So the first stage is a single question where I ask participants to just tell me their story of caring from a distance, the events and experiences that are important to them. And then I sat and held the silence, and I thought, some people talked for 15 minutes, some people talked for 50 minutes, and I just jotted down a few notes about what they'd said and then came back and prompted in the sequence of events they described for a bit more depth around that. So you mentioned that your mother had a fall and was admitted to hospital. Can you tell me more about how it felt at that time? So hopefully that will give you some insight into data collection and the process. So the next slide, thanks Clarissa, is just about the analysis, and we're going to get to the good stuff soon. This is just so that people think about the sort of rigor involved. So what happened was, once I'd met with people who had shared their story, I produced a summary story for participants in the form of a narrative letter, and sent that back to them with a kind of overview of what they described and key themes And then I asked people to write back to me and tell me how it had landed, whether they agreed or disagreed, if I'd missed something, and trying to check the validity really of my interpretation, but also co-construct a story. So once I had all these narrative letters and summary stories from each participant, I then looked to across all of them to identify the key events that people were describing, with each event what evaluation the participant had made of that, and then my interpretation. And through that narrative analysis, I looked to produce a meta-narrative, which is a story of stories, a sort of false document, an overview, and that's what I'm going to share with you today, and that's what I think the good stuff is. So the next page, please, Clarissa, is just showing you where I got the 12 participants from and who they were. So this is a little bit of demographic information around them. So most of them were women, a mixture of ethnicities, but mostly white British, and a mix of professions represented. So as you can see, I mentioned before that I think the networks we used meant it's probably more likely that I recruited people who were similar to me or known to me on Twitter. So a lot of health and social care professionals, but not exclusively. And most of the sample came from London. So I think it's more likely that there were distance carers maybe in the capital, possibly more likely to move there for work. And that's certainly backed up by some evidence in geographical mobility. And in the graph to the left, you can see the caring distances that people were travelling and supporting their parents. Okay. So the next slide, thanks Clarissa, if that's okay, is on the timeline of events. So here, these are the things that people describe to me that they experienced. And I've sort of chunked this into 4 chapters that I'm going to talk with you a little bit more about in depth. So I'll go through each of these one by one now and think about how distance shared the caring experience. So the first part is the arrival of dementia. People talked with me about sort of becoming aware of cognitive changes. So that wasn't their language, but what people described was noticing that something wasn't quite right, noticing that there were some personality changes. Often this was reported over the phone, or there would just be instances that were out of character and maybe weren't expected. And often people couldn't make sense of these, but in hindsight, with a diagnosis, could connect that with the dementia. And about half of the participants were actively involved in facilitating the diagnosis, advocating for their parent, travelling the distance and attending meetings. But the other half sort of struggled to identify when a diagnosis was made and weren't involved in the memory service assessment. Some people found out more remotely and were more likely to receive the news via phone or email. And one of my participants described that as being like a flashbulb memory of just getting an email with the news around that. And I think that has implications. People are getting this news when they're not don't have the potential to be supported at that time. People then talked about trying to problem solve and plan when they had a diagnosis, putting in plans that would help them manage the huge anxiety that came with it. And I think lots of carers reflected on the fact that they felt more anxious because of the distance and they didn't know what was going to happen. And maybe people overcompensated, or maybe it didn't feel like an overcompensation, but they put a lot in place that was difficult to balance. The people talked about feeling like a control freak, that there was something where it was too much risk actually. So they would look to mitigate that risk by monitoring, watching cameras, which was hard to switch off from, and trying to find a workable routine with visits and work and looking after their children. So the next slide, thanks Clarissa, is on part 2, which is I've referred to as taking action. So I think this is the busy period where people talked with me about their need to build networks really of care, and people were stepping into these roles where they were suddenly, recruiting carers, organising with family, felt a huge sense of responsibility through the absence of what was provided elsewhere, I think. And often decisions around who would provide what care wasn't decided based on proximity. There were really difficult conversations that people had, often over family WhatsApp groups. And I think at best, siblings had the potential to come together and find a new meaning and a good relationship through this, and maybe have contact that they wouldn't otherwise have had. But at worst, it could cause massive ruptures in relationships and big frustration. And every family has a history. Dementia doesn't occur in a vacuum. It impacts, and there are people behind that are managing that, as well as all the practical and logistical demands of care. People talked about the difficulty of communicating with home carers, struggles to find agencies. I think something really, really important is about underserved communities, and the fact that a lot of ethnic minorities find it even harder to find a carer that's appropriate and suitable and speaks the language. And these are difficulties carers face, but they're exacerbated by the distance, because people need that support more, and it's harder to coordinate and trust and build those relationships. People talked about the issues of services, that services were really patchy. There's a sense that GPs don't have time, and they're seeing somebody different every time with these new models of care. And that means a constant retelling of stories, re-explaining the divisions between agency and social care. It's hard to navigate, even, for me as a professional, but for carers, people said there's no handbook. People also talked about feeling aloneness as a distance carer and not fitting the mould. I remember somebody said to me, there's almost an exclusivity at carer networks. There can be a status attached to that level of commitment. I mean, those people have made a huge sacrifice. It is then really hard to entertain that there may have been another way to do things. So I think that has implications around who's included and who isn't when we think about a dementia carer. People then talked about everything changing. There would be a crisis, a fall, something that then meant that the plans they put in place no longer worked. And often people were stepping into roles when another parent had died. And it was so hard acting in the presence of grief to support their parent living with the dementia. And there was no support at this time, and a huge amount of uncertainty. And then people also talked about the kind of managing the impact on their life. Where people made decisions to stop working or to work freelance, and that was really high pressure for people. There's a sense that you couldn't just pop down or to see because of the huge costs of trains or the difficulties in booking flights, and that you're sort of always on the periphery of your own family and relationships, and that this stress is quite abstract. Always bubbles along. There's this sense that there are people who are with their phone all the time, connected through that, waiting for it to go. So the next slide, please, Clarissa. It's just on part 3, feeling the difference. So here people talked with me about their experience of the distance and what that was like. And I had a sense from the story that people set off, they have this shock, and then they go into doing mode, and then a bit later the feelings catch up. And this is something that I think we can all relate to maybe as well with COVID. I think there was quite an acute phase where we were full of adrenaline, and now everyone's tired and feeling more. And I think when people talked about the distance, it shaped the quality of people's relationships, and that changed. So visits and time spent together became a lot more task orientated and focused on care. People felt like they were missing out, that they weren't with the parents to enjoy that time whilst they had the opportunity. And there's a sense of constantly always being torn and in the wrong place at the wrong time, and just wishing that you could be there and do something. But also it's quite protective having that space as well. Like you could switch off, put it behind you when you left, and that was really valuable as well. So two sides to every coin. The next bit people talked about was how they experience visits, and I think they're shaped by the distance in a way that they bring an intensity. I remember one of my participants saying it's like it's kind of like a juice, you dilute the concentration, and I think it's this idea that because you're not with it all the time, you can't acclimatise, and there would be these big build-ups to visits. The journey would be travelled alone. People would be very anxious about what they'd find, what might have changed, and people talked as well about the loss being more evident with these kind of snapshots in between visits, that things could be quite shocking and harder to see because you'd be more aware of the deterioration. People talked as well about how, they may have left that place and space where that parent lives behind for a reason, and it can be quite triggering of past events and emotions just going to the family home and providing support there. And equally, it's hard to leave because when you leave, you don't know when you're next going to be back. And that sort of forced endings in a way that just again raised sort of intensity and acuteness of that. And then finally, people talked about kind of feeling like their identity had changed, and in a way where I felt there was a sense identity had become more fragmented and split. So people talked about, the healthcare professionals talked about this idea of, feeling like they should know better, be able to do more because of the training they've had, but that doesn't apply in a personal context. Also talked about kind of having the experience of still being a child to that parent and experiencing that loss, as well as being a parent to their own children, and that not meshing all in the same moment when they were together. And I think identity is something that we can think about, what it means to people, what do they think of what they're doing at the time. So the next slide, Clarissa. Thank you so much, Clarissa, for clicking through these. The final part is around facing the future. So again, people in different phases and stages post-diagnosis when they were speaking to me. But people who had been caring for a really long time talked with me about how they found a way to cope with those feelings and respond. People talked about letting go and accepting that there was a lot out of their control. I remember somebody said to me, I don't know if it's less painful, but there is less of a struggle. And I think it's this kind of trial and error and not expecting things to work forever and not judging yourself on whether they fail, but trying to connect and hold on to what you are doing and the difference it makes. So finding meaning through caring. And lots of people talked about how they felt they had overcome an aspect of distance in their relationship by providing this closeness they newly found through caring. People talked about actually how the distance wasn't feasible, and they made decisions to move a parent closer to home, but that was very mixed in the sample. Not everybody did that. And it wasn't possible. And I think these decisions can be very difficult and cause a lot of conflict for carers if they're thinking they're responsible and they can't speak with their parent about what their views might be because they didn't have any support to plan for the future. People talked with me after they'd lost their parents about the fact that grief felt shaped by the distance, that actually in a way, because you weren't so connected with it, it felt more abstract, the loss, and it felt less tangible, and it felt more messy, and it felt hard for people to realise because they didn't realise what you were experiencing, what you'd lost as well. And there are different aspects of grief. I think people grieve for what they were never able to have as well. And finally, people talked about sort of being left with the memories and fearing a future where they themselves would need care. So the next slide, Clarissa, I just want to highlight some key themes that I think have come from the interviews, and I'd be really, really Keen to think what your impression is as well, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the chat box. But for me, I think some of the things that struck me were the amplified emotions, the intensity of it, the fact that people are more likely to be alone, the fact it's difficult to build good relationships with services, and services are always letting people down. I can imagine that even more the case now because of the pressure that services are under as well. And I think communication is a big issue. So just leave that with you. And then the next slide, Clarissa, if that's okay, is on the logistical challenges of caring. So the fact that distance is differently demanding, and it's not to dismiss that these demands and challenges don't exist for carers who are closer as well. I think there's lots of these things that dementia care would resonate with a lot of dementia carers. But I think, again, it's just the practicalities of supporting distance carers through that decisions. Everything's more complicated because it involves travel and the costs of that, essentially. And then the next slide, Clarissa, if that's okay, is just thinking about identity and how carers view themselves. And I think for me is a sense that there are lots of different aspects of this. They're often unacknowledged, they're often unnamed, and they're often unheard. So how can we support carers and distance carers to recognise them and integrate these parts to have a better outcome and experience of caring? So the next slide, please, Clarissa, is just on the protective aspects as well. So I think the fact that caring does present an opportunity for a new way of doing things and for a new closeness, and it's really, really powerful, the deep sense of purpose that people described having and gaining through caring. And then also that, you know, they felt like they could put it away, and that having their own life and maintaining that was really, really important because their role as a carer would come to an end. So I think there's important learning about that as well. So the next slide, Clarissa, is just around the clinical recommendations. And I think for society, we need to recognise that distant dementia carers exist. We need to find a way to reach them. And I think these are the sort of things that I was thinking before COVID and people would have said were difficult, but now we've just done it because we've needed to. And, you know, services have been more flexible and set up virtual groups. I think employers need to allow more flexible working and support carers for carers leave. We need to have more of a community psychology approach to working with carers. And we need to invest in networks because it will involve networks of care that can't be left on the shoulders of family members. We need to think about how family members can be supported to build those networks that they need, but that they're part of it. They're not the sole provider of that care, because that's not sustainable. People will burn out. So some implications for services. The next slide, Clarissa, if that's okay. I think services need to strive to include distance carers. I think, you know, I know myself, there's so much to do and services are stretched. And, you know, if I had a magic wand, I would invest a magic wand in millions of pounds. I'd invest a lot more in support for carers. But I think people need to avoid making assumptions with their attitudes around how involved somebody is just because of how close they live. And carers assessments need to include aspects of distance care. So look at the financial consequences, the impact on work, look at technologies that people need. And we really also need to think and hold in mind and improve services for underserved communities and ethnic minorities who, you know, we struggle to have translators, we struggle to have the appropriate services that people need, and I think that makes it even more complicated for distance carers. I think we can work with people's stories as therapeutic opportunities. I think we can help with that. People process emotions, think about their identity, and make sense of what they've experienced. I think there's something around riding the waves of the emotions of distance carers, and ACT I think has a lot to offer as a therapy for distance carers with a good evidence base. I also think that we need to think about what we're offering and when, and timing is so important. People might not need that support at diagnosis, and a lot of support has gone into early diagnosis, but the feedback I had from carers was that I didn't need it then, I needed it when everything changed and I suddenly became responsible. And yeah, I think that's really important and reflect how we channel specialist services into acute settings and primary care and everything else. So the next slide is just thinking about distance carers. I think I've put here some implications where, you know, I hope all the distance carers listening can acknowledge how stressful it is and can recognise that and validate the emotions that they're experiencing. I think people that I spoke to found it helpful to know that they actually weren't alone with that. And also that you can find workable solutions and they'll only work for as long as they work. And it is a trial and error. You know, we're learning today about the webinar. It's the first time we've done it. Things don't always go smoothly. And that's not about a personal failing. That's life. I think carers need to think and just be aware of whether, you know, some of what they're doing with controlling or trying to set things up, whether that's trying to overcompensate the anxieties they feel at a distance. Again, I think it's important that they maintain boundaries with their own lives because that's going to help them sustain in the role. You can't pour from an empty cup is one of my favourite phrases. And I think people need to assert themselves and recognise what their needs are in the situations, maintain their life as much as they can and connect with the meaning. So the next slide, Clarissa, should hopefully be a very beautiful picture of some mountains and a lake, which I just wish I was there and we were all there having this, not over MS Teams. But my reflections on doing this is that it's actually been very powerful as a process. I've been really struck by the kind of depth of emotion that people have shared with me, and it feels really hard to convey that in this way at this time, but I hope that you've got a sense. It's hard to do it justice and to synthesize when every story is so rich an overall picture. And I think as well, I think there's something around maybe the open-ended nature of the methods that's allowed people to come forward a bit more and not be constrained by what they're asked. So finally, the sort of food for thought that I want to leave you with, and I hope will set the context for the Q&A and the discussion. That distance carers exist. So how do we all know that? Do we recognise that? And how are we acknowledging that? What are we doing to support them with their unique challenges? How are we thinking about caring and carers? What conditions are we implicitly setting in society about membership to that group, and what are the consequences? And how are we thinking about grief and loss and acknowledging that to support carers? And finally, just thinking about the reach and extending this work. If anyone's got any ideas, I'd be really, really interested in how this has landed with you. I hope that you've all heard me okay. And the next slide, Clarissa, is a thank you slide for listening to me, and thank you especially for listening and waiting with the technical difficulties. That's my email address, so I would love to hear from you if that feels more comfortable than the chat box, or you've got more to say. Please reach out to me. I've got my Fiverr next week, so this would be really helpful for me to think and strengthen the work, and I'd love to build on it. So yeah, Clarissa, that's all me. Hopefully you'll come back to me and we can discuss this together.
Very much, Sarah. That was really, really interesting. I'm just now looking at all the questions, so I hope we've got lots of people joining us now, and please post your questions in the Q&A. And so one of the first questions, Sarah, by Kelly. How can we help a person with dementia recognize a person or family member? Also, not having family being upset by seeing a loved one upset. Sarah?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, Clarissa. Yeah. Can I just check, how can we help somebody?
How can we help a person with dementia recognize a person or family member?
So in terms of recognize them, in terms of recognize who they are when they visit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is what's difficult as well, is like people, and some of the anxieties that people talked about when they were visiting is actually, would they be recognised and would they be remembered? And I think it's a difficult thing to know how, whether you are recognised, and there's different levels of that. Sometimes people will know who you are, and they might not know exactly who you are, what your name is, or how you're known to them, what the link is in the family member, but they'll feel safe and they'll relate in a different way than they would have if you were completely unfamiliar. And I think just some grounding people and explaining who they are, showing pictures, I think that will help with recognition. So I hope that answered the question, but I think it's quite a complicated concept as well of recognition.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's loads of questions coming in here. Thanks for that, Sarah. So one of the next questions, who do we pick? So did distance from Anonymous, did distance carers mention providing care for long-term conditions in addition to dementia? So for example, diabetes, stroke or asthma?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there is lots of physical health difficulties. So those aspects, because with an aging population and people themselves have all different aspects of their health that can go wrong, but what we know is that it's more complicated when there's a dementia involved as well. So people talked about their parents having a cancer or needing a lot of physical health treatment, but they felt like they needed to be there to support their parent and advocate during that time. So I think it actually puts the fact that there's a dementia and there's a physical health need. Somebody without a dementia could probably manage those appointments independently. They might want support, but actually when if somebody has a dementia, the need for a family member to be involved is much more likely, because you need somebody to think through and help support decision making around choices with physical care, and to advocate and represent that person. So I think it's really important. Lots of people mentioned that, and I think it puts these are the kind of appointments that distance carers would be taking time off work to go and support their parent to attend, and help them make decisions around it and support them with the next steps. So at physical health care, so absolutely they mentioned it.
Yeah, thank you. And another question from Josie Dixon. You said that services were patchy, Sarah. Were there services or modes of delivery that were uniquely relevant to distant carers, or
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question, and I think it's really important to think about what we can provide and what an ideal model of care would be. And I've also done a review looking at models of care for carer support. I've thought a lot about this, but the things that people mentioned hearing about and wishing they had were Admiral nurses and dementia navigators. So they used to exist in more places, but they've been cut and they're not in very many places anymore. But somebody who will do the phone calls, that will help you make sense of what you need to do where, and help you navigate the infrastructure and know who is there for you and what they can do to support you. So that, I hope that's answered the question, Clarissa. Could you?
Yeah. I'm just note that's I'm reading some very interesting comments here from long distance carers who've joined us, Sarah, which will be interesting to hear for you and for everyone else. So Nicola just wrote, I've been using the Facebook portal with my parents and it's been an absolute godsend. I bought it for Mum just before lockdown, and she doesn't always recognize me, but it has been really helpful for my dad when he's been reaching out for support. So thank you, Nicola, for sharing that. And someone has also shared anonymously, having to return from overseas and to a family network that I choose to be distant from has been a challenge. So there's all these challenges, I suppose, resonating with what you found as well, Sarah?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing is, I think it's not right that services make expectations. I'm not saying that everybody's like this at all. I know there's so many good, thoughtful healthcare professionals thinking about it, and I don't think it's just services that do this, but I think policy, I think a lot of the language, they make some assumptions around what it means to be a carer and what it means to be caring for, caring about. It's quite complicated, and I think that distance carers, I think we should be curious about how someone is experiencing caring and what's coming up for them and what they need support with, and if they do need to speak to family, what might come up there and what might some of the challenges be, and how could that be made easier?
Yeah, and we've got a question from Paul as well, which you may have answered in your presentation maybe as well. Does technology help to bridge the distance gap between people, Sarah?
Yeah, I think technology has a really important role. I think that technology absolutely does help. I think again, thought needs to be given around that. So cameras and people watching. There's lots of ethical considerations with that, and there's lots on the market, and there's been a lot of development in technologies. But you often they rely on somebody learning how to use them, and they're not that feasible. So I think it's difficult. I remember one of the carers talked to me around having a system with a neighbour where they would alert them if the newspaper wasn't collected from outside the door, and that would be an indication that something wasn't right. And I think we can get very advanced and high tech with these things, but yeah, technologies have a place, but also simple communication and still using the phone and thinking about who's at either end of it is really important.
Yeah, especially in the time of COVID, really, getting used to that digital technology and social distancing. So we've got a comment from Anonymous about Admiral nurses. So not everyone might know about Admiral nurses, but they directly support the carer around the person with dementia. They are not available, sadly, in every area, but they do have a helpline that is available nationally for all carers. So that's formal and informal carers. So for those of you who might not have heard of Admiral nurses before, but might need some support or want to find out about it, that's a good idea. Thank you very much for sharing that. And there's also another question, Sarah. I mean, there's loads. What ways do you think that care providers can evaluate how they help caring from a distance?
So what ways can care providers, and is that carers like services?
Yes.
Like all home carers?
Yes, services, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that care providers can start by asking what a carer needs, and then seeing how they can measure up against those needs and how those needs are met. So you can survey general satisfaction with a service and see what the issues are. But I think the thing about distance carers is like making that data accessible and available through like virtual links or surveys, through like emails, and asking for feedback around the service satisfaction. I think things that you could measure against as well would be like people's satisfaction with communication, their comfort with risk and how that was managed. Yeah, I think it would be good to think about how to evaluate that.
Mm-hmm. And we've got, one more question maybe we have Joe Wren. It might pick up on some of the other questions. So how can we generally improve carers assessment and the access to services with limited budget? So that picks up on you mentioned that a little bit as well in terms of, I suppose, socioeconomic background. So some people might not have the financial budget to buy these services. And how can that be facilitated better, Sarah?
I think that's a big question, and I think that I'm sure there's be lots of people who have ideas that I'd invite to answer in the Q&A box. But something that people mention to me is like often the first question on these assessments is, do you live in the same borough as the person you're caring for? And if you answer no, you can't be registered as a carer. So I think something like that is really simple and important to fix. Actually, if services can't acknowledge and like register you as a carer because you're outside of the borough of the person you're caring from, that's highly problematic. And I don't know if that's the case everywhere. But I think, yeah, a bit of flexibility in the assessment. I don't think that costs any more to like get rid of that question, but I think there are big challenges in doing it with limited budgets. I think what carers shared with me was that there was a frustration that more advice wasn't shared with them, and I think maybe sometimes people hold back suggestions or solutions because they aren't willing to cost it. And I think carers have said that, because I think maybe there's some anxieties about we don't want to let people know what they could have if we're not willing to fund it. Or maybe if we fund, if we do that, we'll become liable if they're then not using the equipment properly. But actually, without those thorough assessments, we need to think how we can share that information in a different way so that people have access to it, even if they have to self-fund. So I don't know. Those are some thoughts I've got. I don't know if you have any more, Clarissa.
Yeah, it's certainly a very big question, which there's no one single answer to it, and there's lots of barriers to people accessing support, both people living with dementia and carers in the community. So lots of work still needs to be done, as often the postcode lottery, etc. Okay, so one last comment from Anonymous is that hoping that going forward remote consultations can happen because this could prevent carers having to take time off work. Thank you very much. And there's been generally loads of questions. Thank you all so much. First of all, thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us over the phone from Alder Hey and giving this presentation. Thank you, Sarah.
No, thank you so much for listening. I really hope that people have heard me, and I've really encouraged people to get in touch if they can. And I'm sorry that this hasn't worked through Teams, but yeah, thanks everyone for your patience and your interest, and thanks Clarissa for hosting it and managing it so well.
Thank you very much. And now, so thank you everyone for joining in. We've had loads of questions, and this was the first time we've held this forum as a webinar, so maybe hopefully next time it'll go really smoothly. Here's to hoping. And for those of you who haven't clicked on the survey link yet, it'd be great if you could just answer 4 really quick questions so we know where you're coming from and your background, so whether you're affected by dementia yourself, for example, just so we know kind of who we're targeting with these webinars. And in front of you, you should now see a slide about the next forum event, which will be held on the 16th of September, again from 1 till 2 o'clock. There'll be a webinar again, and we will be talking about some of our COVID-19 dementia care research and how the public health restrictions from COVID-19 are impacting on the lives of older adults and those that are living with dementia and those that are caring for someone with dementia. And there's the link to the Eventbrite as well, but you will receive this as well if you've signed up to receive further news. So thank you very much. And afterwards, this presentation will be posted on YouTube as well, so you can look back at it. Thank you very much. Bye now.